Let me introduce Joanna Lewis, who is an assistant professor at Georgetown University, has been working on issues related to energy, especially renewable energy in China and elsewhere, and she will lead us off on a presentation, and then we'll open up. Joanna, all yours.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'm very sorry to have missed the conference in December. I was in Poland attending the UN climate negotiations, which were that week as well, as some of you may know. And I'm also very appreciative that you all came on the Friday before spring break, so it's good to see you all. Today I'll be talking about China's response to its energy and environmental challenges. I'll start discussing some of the really unprecedented economic achievements to date that we've been seeing in China, what's happening, what the current challenges are in terms of China's environment today, what that might mean down the road, what the response has been by policymakers in China to environmental situations, and particularly environmental issues stemming from China's energy use. And then looking a bit into the future, I've been asked to be, I hate to, try to look into the crystal ball, and I, of course, would never try to predict what could happen in a place as dynamic and as China. But I would like to talk a bit about some of the factors that I think could be drivers of responses to the government to environmental issues down the road. Starting with economic achievements to date, as we know, China has really achieved very impressive rates of economic growth. This has been credited with pulling, depending on the numbers that you look at, roughly 400 million people out of poverty by some estimates. These are some of the World Bank's estimates. They also have an economy that is 3 times more energy efficient today than it was 3 decades ago, which has been extremely impressive, and I'll talk a bit more about that. This is actually a graph looking at China's energy intensity trends over since 1980. And as you see, until recently, which I'll come back to, China's energy intensity was decreasing very rapidly. Energy intensity, what that means is energy use per unit of economic growth. So if you can use less energy to achieve the same level of economic output, it's better for you, it saves you money, it's better for the environment. Yes?
Question? Quick question.
Yep.
What exchange rate did you use there? Is that PPP?
This is, if you can read the small money, it's a market exchange, not PPP. Yep, and that's adjusted for 2,000 US dollars. If you look at PPP, it does look a bit different, and we can talk about that. I personally think it makes a little more sense to look at that for energy intensity, but that's an interesting topic of discussion. And one other thing I should mention is GDP figures also have been questioned, as well as some of the energy numbers. So this is, this may not be an exact slope. Either way, I think the trend is very clear. There has been a very strong downward trend, and there's also been an upward trend in the early 2000s, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. China has many current environmental challenges, which will likely continue to be exacerbated in the coming years. Air pollution challenges, water pollution challenges, which really exacerbate some of the water scarcity challenges that we already see throughout the country, particularly in the north. Land degradation and the resulting desertification, increasing desertification rates, again, particularly in the north. China's reliance on coal is actually increasing rather than decreasing. China's energy-intensive industries are also increasing in terms of their overall contribution to the total economic output of the country. And China is now likely the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. So talking briefly about air pollution, I've just put up a couple of highlighting statistics that are often referred to. And again, there's maybe some controversy over the sources of these. There's often many ways to measure things, like the most polluted city in the world is somewhat of a term that you could define many ways, but according to, and I should mention that I have a paper, of course, that explains all of these things and the sources in more detail if you're interested in where some of these numbers come from. I'm happy to share that with anyone. But according to a recent World Bank report, 20 of the 30 most polluted cities in the world are located in China. This air pollution is been said to cause 500,000 and up premature deaths per year, increased rates of asthma. Majority of pollution in China stems from power plants and industrial facilities, but another important area to also consider is in rural areas, indoor stoves. used in households for cooking, for heating. Often direct coal use or charcoal use is also a very big problem for public health. And there's been some good research done on that, including by some of my former colleagues out in Berkeley. Acid rain is also a large problem, which is caused by this air pollution and ends up affecting agriculture, which then has implications for food supply. And poor air quality has been estimated to cause an overall welfare cost to China of anywhere between 3 to 8% of GDP. Again, very tricky number to measure. You may have, some of you may have been familiar with these green GDP estimates that China was looking at doing a couple of years ago. It's obviously a very hard thing to try to quantify it and measure environmental damages, but there is, I think, pretty broad agreement that there is a pretty sizable impact to the economy as a result of the costs on health and the environment that can actually be quantified as a pretty sizable percent of the overall economic output of the country. Looking a bit at energy as a source of a lot of this air pollution, the power sector is the largest source of criteria pollutants. These are your standard air pollutants like sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, as well as carbon dioxide, which we don't worry about so much as a local air pollutant, but more as a global pollutant, a greenhouse gas, and the implications that causes. This is primarily because of coal and the reliance on coal, which currently drives about 2/3 of energy demand in China is fueled by coal, and about 80% of electricity generation today in China powered by coal, quite a sizable amount. And I think what is particularly worrisome is that the share of coal is actually increasing in key sectors despite a lot of really aggressive policies to try to diversify the power supply in China in particular, which I'll talk about. And something to consider if you think about the U.S. Energy supply structure versus China, or the energy demand structure, industry is really responsible for about 70% of energy demand in China. In the U.S., that's very different. Our demand profile is much smaller share from industry, closer to 25%. Our residential, commercial, agricultural consumption is a much bigger share than it is in China. So in China, you're not really looking at sort of the consumer problem, the individual consumer problem with energy. It's much more of an industrial problem. And of course, the fact that China is manufacturing products not just for China, but for the rest of the world in many cases as well. And if you look at projections, these are some projections. I think these were IEA numbers I pulled, where in the electricity sector as well as in the industrial sector, the share of coal in the sector as well as the overall amount of coal is expected to increase dramatically between now and 2030.
Are you taking any questions now or at the end?
It's up to you. I mean, we're going to leave a lot of time for discussion, so I'd be happy to take any clarifying questions, but...
So a very quick question back on the last slide. Is there any sense that the consumer problem in China is yet to come?
Of course, and you certainly see this structure starting to shift. The government is going to be moving more towards a service economy rather than heavy industry, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Okay. So I mentioned that industrial energy demand is responsible for the majority of China's energy demand, but not just industrial demand, heavy industry. And when I say heavy industry, I mean particularly energy-intensive industries. For example, the ones on this graph to the left, iron and steel, cement, chemicals. These are the drivers of the majority of China's energy demand, and the share of energy-intensive industries are actually, in terms of their contribution to the overall share of GDP, is increasing in the economy, which is what you see on this graph on the left. You can see that the industrial value added as a share of GDP in all of these sectors has been going up in recent years. This is worrisome because the Chinese government would prefer to be diversifying away from these energy-intensive industries to more higher-end sectors that would be able to be less energy-intensive, more service sectors. And another thing to keep in mind is that China's energy-intensive sectors are often less efficient than most around the world in many cases. This is not true across the board, but to give you a rough example, you can reflect this either in energy intensity or also in carbon intensity if it's greenhouse gases you're worried about, which we are for various reasons. But as you look here, this is an example of carbon intensity in the steel sector in 2005. You can see that if you look at total emissions, for example, China emits less CO2 per ton of steel only than Russia, and otherwise their steel sector is more carbon intensive than all these other countries around the world. So I mentioned that we've seen, although China had this very impressive decline in energy intensity from 1980 until about 2002, this trend reversed between 2002 and 2005. And the growth in energy consumption outpaced economic growth for the first time in China's modern history, in the last few decades. Why does this matter? It matters because if China, for example, had if its energy intensity had remained frozen where it was in 1977, China would be consuming 3 times the amount of energy as they are today. Because they've been able to become more efficient the way they use energy, they've been able to do some industrial restructuring. These are all various reasons why energy intensity would decline. They've been able to save a lot of energy that they would have otherwise needed. That's a lot of pollution that would have otherwise been emitted as well. There's a lot of reasons why pollution control is challenging in the Chinese context. I think it's important to point out that China actually has some of the most stringent regulations on power plant emissions of any country in the world, including on sulfur dioxide. But the problem is a lot of these standards are just not being met. There's, of course, problems with enforcement at the local level. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that there's a real disincentive to operate pollution control equipment that actually can decrease the net power output from power plants. So if you're running a scrubber and if you're losing power, you actually need to burn more coal to get the same power out of your plant. If you're running pollution control equipment, that takes energy, right? If you wanted to put a carbon capture and storage technology on a coal power plant, of course, this is something we're all starting to talk about. The energy penalty is expected to be much higher, and we don't have a lot of demonstration of these projects around the world. We don't really know, and there's a lot of thought that this could be made much more efficient. But right now, a lot of the numbers that are being put out say that the energy penalty could be as much as 30%. So what does this mean? If China's building 2 coal power plants a week right now, roughly, they might need to build 3 to be able to get the same amount of electricity if you're running carbon capture equipment in a country that is trying to rapidly increase supply to meet energy demand. This is not all that attractive an option, and we can come back to that. This is if you're in a province where power shortages are a problem, there's not a lot of incentive to actually run this equipment that's going to decrease the amount of power you get. And then you can see in this table that a lot of the targets in the 10th five-year plan for air pollution were not met. I do a lot less work on water, but I think it's really important to point out a lot of the water challenges that China's facing in the context of its overall environmental challenges. About 2/3 of China's cities have difficulty accessing water. 70% of water in cities is not suitable for drinking or fishing. And again, a lot of this comes from a recent study that the Chinese Ministry of Environmental Protection, the former State Environmental Protection Agency, and the World Bank put out a year or so ago. About 20% of China's water supply is estimated to be lost through inefficiencies in water use. So inefficiencies meaning, leaky pipes or just wasted water. And northern China, as I mentioned, really bears the brunt of China's water challenges. Water availability per capita in China is about 1/4 of the world average, and in some parts of northern China as much as 1/10 of the world average. And another thing that's important to keep in mind is we're looking at the impacts of climate change in the coming decades. It's expected that northern China the climate change will actually exacerbate this water scarcity issue in a lot of northern China. And this photo is actually a photo of the algal bloom that took place at Taihu in 2007. This was because of a lot of the industrial plants on that lake that caused this algal bloom, and really this was a lake that the local communities all depended on for their water supply. It really became toxified in light of this algal bloom, and this was an interesting case. It was well documented in the New York Times and international media because there were some environmental protests that resulted locally as a result of this, and this is just an example of there is a growing number of protests or civil unrest related to environmental challenges in China. This is not something that I focus a lot on in my work, and it's obviously a hard area to study and to get good information on, but I think this is certainly something to keep in mind and something that is of concern to the leadership in the years to come. And then desertification is another issue in China. Desertification caused by excessive water withdrawals, as well as land degradation. This is particularly an issue in northern and western China, where you see the desert is really encroaching upon places people are living, upon agricultural lands. It's estimated about 400 million people are threatened by the encroachment of the three largest deserts in China. And there's some estimates that there could be a lot of, what we call environmental refugees, people having to move because the land that they're using, maybe for agriculture or for other purposes, are no longer possible because of the encroaching desert. And there's, of course, the sandstorm issues that afflict a lot of northern China, particularly in the spring, which are tied to this as well. Again, this is something that is expected to be exacerbated under climate change and the impacts that China is likely to face. And which leads me to one of the other major environmental challenges China faces, which is their greenhouse gas footprint. So this is now moving from the local to more of the global impact of China's energy use. China is now likely the largest annual emitter. I say likely because there is still some question about data, and it is hard to get very good numbers. But many people now believe China, as of 2007, surpassed the U.S. in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. However, if you look at emissions on a per person basis, per capita, China's emissions are between 1/4 and 1/5 those of a person in the U.S. If you look at cumulative emissions, and by that I mean the overall contribution, if you look over the past century, how many greenhouse gases the U.S. has put up in the atmosphere versus China, the U.S. is far ahead of China there as well. And this is actually an important metric because when we're talking about climate change and we're talking about CO2, CO2 stays up in the atmosphere for about a century. The residence time would be roughly a century. So looking at annual emissions may not be the only metric that really makes sense from a climate change perspective. A lot of China's carbon dioxide emissions do come from coal use. China consumes over twice the amount of coal as the U.S. They are the largest consumer and producer of coal in the world. They are building new coal plants at a scale never before seen around the world. The graph on the left shows the buildup of coal power capacity over the last few decades, comparing that with the total capacity you see in the U.S., India, and in the U.K. If you look at the projections of where China's carbon dioxide emissions might be going, and I should say that I've done a lot of work looking at these projections and how far off they've actually been in recent years, so keeping that in mind, the trends at least are clear, but the IEA, the International Energy Agency, as well as the U.S. Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration both project that CO2 emissions for China will be at 400% above 1990 levels by the year 2030. So how has the government been responding? There's a lot of areas that really are cause for both internal pressures as well as external pressures that the government sees. Of course, there's the internal pressure stemming from local pollution impacts, and I mentioned some of the environmental protests that have been increasing in number. There's also energy security concerns that come from the fact that China is so reliant on coal. Yes, China has a lot of coal, but actually they import a lot of coal as well. Being very reliant on coal, even though they have so much of it, it causes problems internally because the coal is not necessarily located where the demand is. Most of China's coal is in western China and northern China. Most of the demand is on the eastern coast. There's often problems with transportation bottlenecks moving coal around the country. We hear about power shortages often in when there's snowstorms or other, and this is really because the trains can't get there. There's bottlenecks in moving coal around. It's not necessarily because there's just not enough power plants to fuel the demand. There's also energy security concerns relying from the fact that China is so reliant on heavy industry for economic growth. And this is obviously not necessarily a sustainable economic structure to continue to have in coming years, partly because of climate change and local environmental problems that result. Internal pressures also could come from climate change impacts. And I'll talk a little bit about what the scientists in China and outside China are predicting in terms of what the likely impacts are going to be on China as a result of a changing climate. And then, of course, there are the external pressures that the international community, for example, places on China because of their role in the global climate change challenge. The fact that they are number one, this obviously brings a lot of international attention and focus on China in terms of including for the negotiations that are happening right now, looking towards Copenhagen the end of this year. What will China's role be? What will China have to do? This is all certainly a cause of political response. So I'm going to talk now briefly about focusing on what I think the most important areas are. Now what happens to the L? The particularly energy security concerns, the impacts of climate change, and China's role in the international process. So the response to a reliance on coal has been some really aggressive policies to try to diversify away from coal. China has a very aggressive national renewable energy law with targets to achieve 15% of primary energy, 20% of capacity from renewables by 2020. These numbers do include hydropower, and China, of course, does use a lot of hydropower, but they also have targets for non-hydro renewables as well. And wind is increasing extremely rapidly in China. China is now, in terms of annual installations that went in last year, China is the #2 wind market in the world behind the U.S. So this is pretty impressive, and this has just happened within the last 4 years or so. China also uses a lot of pretty basic but very effective renewable energy technologies that we don't use here. For example, the use of solar hot water heaters. These are the hot water heaters you put on your roof. Their use of solar hot water technology exceeds that of all the other countries in the world combined. They also are the leading manufacturer of these technologies. They're manufacturing almost all of these technologies. They're the largest manufacturer of solar photovoltaic panels in the world now as well, although most of those are for export, not for use in China. And they have many domestic wind turbine manufacturers. And a lot of my research looks at what's happening with those wind turbine manufacturers in China. There's a lot of policies also targeting improving energy efficiency. And these policies were primarily motivated by this upward trend in energy intensity, which I showed you, which happened in the early part of this decade. The government, as part of the 11th five-year plan, put in a national energy intensity target 20% below 2005 levels by 2010. There are several other policies that were implemented around the country to try to meet this national target. There's a program that targets the top 1,000 enterprises. This is essentially the 1,000 largest energy-consuming enterprises in China. They've all now had to develop energy efficiency plans. They're all being monitored very closely. Additionally, you see many of the least efficient power plants and industrial facilities have been shut down. There's various rules now that if you're going to build a new plant, you own a large portfolio, you need to shut down some of your more inefficient plants before you can get that permitted. You actually have seen recently the government has played with the value-added tax a bit on exports, such that it would be less, you'd have less incentive to export energy-intensive goods from China, and this was getting around the idea that China doesn't necessarily want to be a base for the manufacturing these energy-intensive goods for the rest of the world. Although I should say, in light of the current economic situation, I believe a lot of these policies have actually been removed because in light of, the government has decided, well, we're happy to encourage growth in any industry, even if it's the energy-intensive industries, if that's what they need. So that's one potential problem to be looking at in the coming years. They've got a lot of energy efficiency policies throughout the country. Their fuel economy standards on vehicles, for example, are actually more stringent than the ones we have in the U.S., which isn't that hard to do. And then briefly, China's international climate change strategy has really been focused on domestic policies and measures. So I think China, all these policies I've just mentioned, these were all policies implemented to meet domestic goals, coal diversification, energy intensity improvements, energy efficiency. These are all policies that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions beyond what they would have been. So they are de facto climate change policies as well, although that is obviously not the primary reason that they were implemented. But this is something that shouldn't be ignored by the international community, and this is actually where a lot of the discussions are going in terms of what China's actions might be internationally, maybe committing to these types of policies that they're doing at the international level. They have also been very active they don't have a target under Kyoto as a developing country, but China's the largest source of CDM credits, the Clean Development Mechanism, selling offsets to Europe and Japan and other countries that have taken Kyoto targets. And of course, despite the fact that China is the largest emitter right now on an annual basis, the fact that the U.S. is the largest historic emitter, was the largest annual emitter until very recently, the fact that the U.S. hasn't been very active in the international negotiations really gives China cover. There's no reason China should come forward and agree to do something before the U.S. does. And so I think this has been actually a very important dynamic. This also is likely to change in the next year or two with the new administration. And so I think this will pose new challenges for China, in particularly in how they engage with the U.S. and how they engage with the international process. China's leading climate scientists, as I mentioned, are stating that future climate change could cause significant adverse impacts on the ecosystems, agriculture, water resources, and coastal zones in China. And I think this focus on the coastal zones and the impacts they're likely to see is actually very important, because this is, of course, the center of economic development in China. You can see that some of the numbers up there. Of course, you've got Shanghai, the Tianjin, the Pearl River Delta region, all very low sea level. A lot of most of this land area is just a meter or so above sea level at the highest point. Very susceptible to flooding, very susceptible to increased storm surges, hurricanes, or typhoons. These are all the types of things scientists are predicting will hit China hard. And the other area, I think the hotspot, if you will, within China in terms of climate impacts is the Tibetan Plateau. This is obviously a politically sensitive area for various reasons. It's also where the watersheds of the rivers that originate from the glaciers in this region flow to basically half the world's population, throughout India, throughout Pakistan, throughout Southeast Asia, as well as throughout China. Most of China's largest rivers originate on the Tibetan Plateau. Glacier retreat is expected to be very rapid in this area, and I think looking at water resource implications from this region will be a very important driver of responses to climate change in China in the coming years. So I'll wrap up with that and just want to leave you with a couple thoughts. I think the current local and global environmental challenges facing China are inherently linked to the challenges the leadership faces in the energy sector, including its heavy reliance on coal and on energy-intensive industry to fuel its economic growth. These recent policy responses, though, that we've seen are the right thing. I mean, they're really getting at these core environmental challenges. They also will help with climate change, as well as the concerns over the current structure of the economy. And I think that while international pressures to address climate change are unlikely to be a major factor in shaping China's response in the near term for the reasons I mentioned, these domestic security impacts due to the climate change impacts that China is likely to face could be severe enough to really catch the attention of the leadership, in particular the party leadership in China, and potentially have a substantial impact on the response that we see China taking to these issues in the years to come. Thank you.
Dr. Xiaowei is currently at the Kennedy School at Harvard University, but he comes to us from Beijing, where he is at the Development Research Council, to give us a more closer to the ground view from China. And we'll hear from him and then we'll open up. It'll just take minutes.
Okay. I'm honored to be here and thank Joanna to give a comprehensive and excellent representation. There was something interesting about the topic of what's the future of the Chinese energy environment, and a lot of information given by Joanna. So give you a conception of how bad or the situation is. So there will be a very interesting thing is what's happened in recent year. So the thing go bad very quickly between 2000 and 2007. You can see in 2007 and from 2000 to 2007 there 100% energy consumption increase. It's dramatically. So this energy consumption and energy intensity just mentioned by Joanna. So you can see from 2002, the energy consumption and the energy intensity level be increase. So what happened? So does it will continue? So it's a very big question. If it continue, it's a very bad conclusion for China and the other world, also for climate change. You can achieve the goal of not reduce, just keep the space. So if you want to know what's the future, so you want to know what happened in the recent years. The direct reason is the heavy industry output increased dramatically, just mentioned by Joanna. So the share of the heavy industry output of GDP increased very quickly. So it resulted in many things mentioned Joanna. So, but why the heavy industry output increased so dramatically? I think there will be a main driving force. It's China's reform and openness, just like 30 years China do. I think there will be the first thing is the relationship between the central government and the local government change. And another, there will be 5 factors I think very important. It's under market reform, the energy market structure reform, and the social reform, and the political reform, and the WTO accession. There will be 5 things to cause the thing. Why? First thing is local government competition. So if you want to understand the growth, economic growth of China, you must understand the local government competition. So the one of the most important reform is central government give right to the local government. You have right to develop your own economy. So it's a very strong competition between different regions. So local government have very strong incentive to development their local economic, by which, so heavy industry, it's a focus. Most of local government in last maybe 5 years, they choose heavy industry to be main sector to promote their economy. So the local government can give the heavy industry company, I give you low price of land, low price of electricity maybe, and I give you the tax cut. So local government have played a great important role in promote the heavy industry growth in China. And there will be another things why they do. If the leader of the local government want to promote to get higher level, you should do good performance in your GDP growth. There will be assessment of high level to the local leader by GDP performance. So there will a strong incentive to do this. And another thing is local resident. If you want to do a bigger heavy industry in your region, so the local resident will don't like to welcome this such pollution company or industry. But you know the political reform the lack of political reform. So the local residents have less power to influence the local government decision. So I think it's under the market reform. The energy market reform in China is lag. So many energy price is relatively low. So I think this is the supply side. Why the heavy industry output will increase so dramatically. But the reform has been a long time. But why 2000 a year? So it's a demand side. There will be another things happened. A big things happened. It's Chinese accession WTO in 2001. So from then, China export growth rate increased crazy. Yes, it's crazy. So I give you the share of the world market increased. So and China became many heavy industry good, net export. According to the economic theory, China has many labor, so it have advantage in labor intensive sector. But why China export so many steel? Before 2004, China is a net import of steel, but now maybe largest net export in the world. China consume energy not for themselves, for the world. They export much of steel to the other world. So you can see why the energy intensive industry increased so dramatically. So there was demand side, no demand side, the thing would not happen. But a supply side, so the two things come together, and you can see the result. The energy intensity increased. So, what's the future? Whether it will continue? So my conclusion is it couldn't. What's the future? We will definitely bet in energy and environmental situation in China. Why? So there will be reasons. First, the world market share couldn't increase as before. China already got maybe 30% of the world market share. You couldn't. You can from the 5% to 10%, 10% to 20%, but you couldn't 30% to 50% or 50% to 70%, especially in some goods. You couldn't get more market share. And the second, China itself couldn't afford a high investment share and industry output share of the GDP. China has the highest of the world of investment share. So the investment share is you get your income, but not consume. You just most of them just to invest. So it couldn't be sustainable because you need to much of demand to continue this. But the first reason you couldn't get much market share. So and the third reason, the political reform. So the central government, they had changed in assessment of local government leader. There will be not GDP, but a lot of things. How the China get the goal of the energy intensity by 20% of the central government set. Many people said it's impossible, but China, what China do? China divided the goal to each province they will assign a contract. You must do, and the province, the leader of province, will divide it to maybe the much local government, and the local government also divided the go to the major industry in their city. So they will sign contract with the owner of the factory. You need to get the go. If otherwise you will. So China will do this by the political level by level. So it's a big change, not GDP, but energy intensity. If you couldn't get the intensity, you will maybe your future is not so good as before. So, and the other thing is the enhance of the central government law. You know, the Bureau of Energy Administration in China, this bureau is do a lot of things, energy issues in China. They oversight, but how many people they own? Well, just 100. But also there were other institutions. They will be focused on energy issues, but the mainly people. Most of people in Bureau of Energy Administration, I know DOE maybe 4,000 or so a larger. China will enhance the central government law to, if you want to build a heavy industry company, you need to get approval of the central government. But you just only have 100 people. How do you can make decision? So it's and the second thing is the official level. China is a country, so which one is higher? They have more power to decide. So the Bureau of Energy Administration, the leader of the Bureau of Energy Administration, they just secretary level. Secretary just like U.S. Secretary of Energy, but most powerful energy company, for example CNPC, there will be much high level. There will be a Communist Party, Central Committee of Communist Party. The leader of the energy company, large company, their leader will be in the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So they have less people, less power to do the energy policies. But these things will change in the future. So the central government will have more power to coordinate, to reduce the efforts of the local government as before. The fourth thing is energy market reform. It's going. So energy price will not be as low as before. It will go up. So example is oil tax reform early this year. And so my conclusion is the thing changed, couldn't as before. So the energy intensity will be bad, but how bad, I don't know. But there will be a bigger conclusion. You wouldn't say the thing as before. There will be change. So it's my conclusion. And next, what the Chinese government need in the climate change? I just want to mention. I know some top leaders have view maybe to set the goal of the CO2 reduction, just as the international society want them to do. But I think the most importantly, they lack capacity to do this bigger decision. So I think the most important thing is the capacity building of government. For example, if you want to set the goal of CO2 reduction, how much, when, what's the impact, and what's the policy? So there are so many questions needed to answer. Just like in US, there will be a lot of people to talk about, but in China, the capacity is important thing. So research is very important. So it's my response.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I open up for questions, maybe I should give both of you a chance to respond to what you've heard from each other. And by way of framing that, first to thank both of you, but especially, actually both of you, but I did want to point out sort of what Xiaowei said, which is unusual, that the future is better. You don't hear that these days, except by way of someone saying it's so bad now that it has to be better. Which is probably not what you're saying, but I found it intriguing that you said the top leaders have the will but lack the capacity. Most discussions in most countries I work in is about they have the capacity to change, but they don't have the will. So I'm actually very, very happy about that. But 2 points to raise to both of you. One is, and I was going to do this at the end of this thing, but just to make the point, we have a little gift for our guests, and appropriately, it's made in China. I checked. And what Xiaowei seems to be saying is that because this is being used by the Pardee Center, the carbon used to produce this and transport this is not China's carbon, it's the US carbon. Now that has impact on the negotiation, and one hears it in Poznan and Bali, and sort of how do you count these? If in fact China becomes the factory to the world, then is the pollution China's pollution, or is it the world's? I raise that as a provocative one. The second point I raise provocative just to get some conversation going here is, if I had heard about any country in the world, including the US, that the history of the last 10 years was rapid increase in energy efficiency. Both of you had that graph going down. Rapid increase in energy efficiency, opening to the world, decentralization, high standards including in automobiles, new standards including in governance of pollution. I would have said, what a wonderful country and what a wonderful energy policy. So why are we not all dancing in the rain about what is happening in China? I think I know the answer, but I just wanted to raise that as a provocative setting up to give both of you a chance to respond either to that or anything that you heard. Joanna, you want to go first?
Sure.
And then we'll open up.
Well, I think those are some great questions, and I had sort of circled a few points on Xiaowei's talk, which really are exactly those. I guess I'd like to start with the question about, or I guess the comment that you ended with about some of the leaders have the will but don't have the capacity. And in the time I've spent in China talking to people, I would completely agree with that. And I think that's actually misunderstood here in the U.S. and in particularly in Washington, where I am, because when we start to talk about climate change, we start to point fingers at each other and say, well, why should we do anything if you're not doing anything, and why should you do anything if we're not doing anything? And it's just so easy to fall down that road. I think we need to really change the conversation. I think it really needs to be about how can we help China do what they want to do anyway, and how can China help themselves do what they want to do anyway. I think that a lot of the policies I mentioned, this energy intensity target, is a very aggressive target. We don't have we have a voluntary targets we put forth similarly. They have a very aggressive national renewable energy targets. The problem is implementation, and which gets at the second part of your question about if you've got all these great targets, all these great policies on the book, why do we still have these problems? And I think, Xiaowei very clearly explained at the local level how the incentives there are just not there. And part of it's a capacity problem. It's a staff problem. It's the fact that the Energy Bureau is so small. The Ministry of Environmental Protection even smaller. I think especially if you look at all the way down to the local level and the people staffed all the way through. The Statistical Bureau, also not very well staffed. You can't do anything unless you can measure it. You don't know if you've met a target if you don't know where you were, where you're going, where you're trying to get to.
If you don't measure it, it hasn't happened.
Exactly. You don't know where to set your target if you don't know where your emissions are today. You don't know if you've met them if you can't measure where you are tomorrow. So I think that this is really at the core of where a lot of the capacity needs to be increased. And I think this is something that the Chinese government is very aware of and is doing a lot of really innovative things to do that. You mentioned, for example, the fact that local officials are often promoted based on, how their GDP growth potential. My understanding, and maybe you could comment on this, is that in conjunction with a lot of these energy intensity policies, promotion is now actually tied to being able to meet the energy intensity targets. As you said, that they've actually tried to take these central level targets and break them down, to the local level, so that the way in which local officials are promoted is actually now tied to these energy intensity targets, not just to the GDP part of the equation, but also to the energy to GDP
Promotion
ratio.
by performance. What an odd idea.
But it's a different type of performance, right? I mean, and so it's interesting. I mean, I think, and I'm sure this is only happening in some places. I think that it's an interesting model because it gets at this local level incentive problem and how you can change incentives at the local level along with increasing capacity, such that you could actually really help implementation of these things on the ground. And just very quickly on your question about emissions and where they come from, where products are being manufactured, I mean, this is a very important topic. And again, to bring it to Washington, I mean, some of the actual climate legislation that's being discussed looks at how you would put trade measures at the border to adjust for the imports of carbon-intensive products from other countries. U.S. industries are worried about losing jobs to China if we have a carbon tariff. They don't. I think that, I actually mentioned that China actually has already disincentives at the border to export energy-intensive goods. Some people have equated that to the equivalent of a $50 a ton carbon tax that China is self-imposing on some of their exports, depending how you measure this. And I said this may have actually been removed recently, but I think it's very interesting to think about how carbon is flowing around the world. We, in the context of the UN discussions, we look at this, we put a cap over countries and decide, here's your emissions, here's where you're going. But you actually need to get at the flows, because you will have this problem where one country's doing something, another country's not. You call it the carbon leakage problem. It only is going to work if everyone is somehow tied in. And I think focusing on these energy intensive industries is certainly one place to start.
Very briefly, and then we'll open up.
Okay. Talking about the export commodity contain carbon, so I think yes, there are a lot of people in China. They talking about so we are not just produce for ourselves, but they just mentioned the development mode of China in the past. Is totally, not totally, but mostly wrong. You not get, China is not energy resource, rich of energy resource, but they produce so many energy intensive goods. So there were a big incentive to change this mode of but just as I mentioned, there were a lot of obstacles, especially the local government and the central government. They are not always the same direction. So in China, I think they will welcome to consider this phenomena of how to say, but I think there will be a lot of a complicated thing to negotiate to other country. I don't think they will choose. So
Yeah, I think sort of as other people in the room actually work on this, we are creating a new global currency in carbon. And how we use that currency is going to become a hot topic. But we'll start from Professor Hasnath.
Well, as regards the first question, which raised in my mind that there is a widespread feeling among the specialists and also the media people that environmental issue in China is largely because of two things. A, lack of political will, and B, lack of resources, including good source of energy and finance. And we have already discussed, you presented your presentation and all these things, but I want to set the question along with the objective of Pardee Center, long-term future. We have also noticed that if prophet does not go to mountain, then the mountain comes to prophet. That means if there is so much of pollution in China because of heavy industry and factory, then factory is moving to Africa and factory is moving to Latin America where there is a resource and cheap energy. And if this continues, then the whole international political structure will change, right? So how do you think in, not exactly the CO2 pollution or SO2 problem, but how do you look at that energy and environment eventually leading to not the two parties concerned, but a new international order will take place? There is no right. That is one. And as regards the Harvard professor, it is difficult for me to pronounce correctly his name, so I will better address Harvard professor. I'm originally from economics. You have a lot of points, but I'll just, address one point, and it is the heavy manufacturing versus the light manufacturing. Industry has got its own character and nature and structure, and it is not always easily substitutable, right? And China, at this stage of takeoff, and if you look at the history of economic development at the takeoff stage, it is the heavy industry which eventually leads, right? So even there is a local reform and central government and provincial government and seminar, international, all these things, it is very difficult on the part of China to move. And even in the long-term future, again, that Western countries' industrial experience, they moved from manufacturing to service sector. One of the major things was language, right? English was lingua franca, and education and health and banking and other service sector spread very quickly. I do not see any that big future coming 20 years on part of China. So China will have to remain in the heavy manufacturing, and under that circumstances, how do you look at the future?
Why don't I take a couple of more questions so that we have a question right there, and then so we'll take three and then give you.
So kind of building on that second question, you talked about kind of in the first presentation, talking about policies and kind of changing China's manufacturing and kind of looking at China's past and how they've developed and investing in strategic industries. You talked about the hot water heaters. Is there a policy to kind of become the leader in developing sustainable technology, kind of retooling the existing manufacturing industry to focus on these longer term, becoming the leader in renewable resources technologies?
Okay, we'll take one more. Right at the back, could we slide back the? Thank you. And if you could also introduce yourself.
I'm a student at BU from CAS, IR major. I was just wondering regarding to Mr. Xuan's presentation that you said that China changed its assessment of local leaders' cadres from a pure GDP assessment to a combination of GDP and energy impact performance. And I was just very interested in what kind of assessment procedure or methods the central government developed in assessing the local cadres and leaders. Because I'm a little doubtful of the statistical aspect or the assessment aspect or ability from the central government, a little bit doubtful on that. And second question is that you mentioned that in China we're now having this energy tax reform or the price reforms. The energy price will not remain that low as to world market price, so it will be additional costs for them to produce those stuff, so the efficiency will have to go down. And I'm also a little doubtful whether that will happen with the advent of the current financial meltdown in China, which, in southern China, there are thousands of companies being closed due to lack of order from other parts of the world. They have no, orders to produce their goods. So I'm wondering if that will be postponed to the infinite future, or do you see that coming in the recent years?
Thank you. I think three very good questions. I would especially sort of highlight both for the center reasons, but also what its impact is on the world. If indeed, as Professor Hasnath says, China clamps down on pollution, will this polluting industry move elsewhere in the world? Is this sort of a problem that we'll be following to Vietnam and to Africa and so on and so forth? But also the question of whether how real is this reform? I should mention, I'll let the experts respond to the language issue, but one scenario is that Chinese becomes the dominant international language. And I say that not entirely jokingly. It is a fast-growing language on the internet. So if we're going to really think of the future, that possibility at least has to be considered. But either of you.
Do you want to start?
So, okay, I asked and replied your two questions. The first question is, what's your first question? Assessment, and I think yes, this is a complicated thing. But National Bureau Statistic, our domestic, they were asked by how to translate the central organization bureau. You nominate the official. They ask NBS, National Bureau of Statistics, to develop a system to assess the local government performance. We had a large project to a lot of institutions to join. My institution also joined this project. How to construct this assessment system. There were a lot of data, and also yes, they have a lot of effort to do this. Maybe not so quickly. So you see, decided which one is up, which one is down. There will be a lot of other factors, but definitely the environmental performance more and more important. So there will be a and the resident, local resident, they have more power to alter the local government decision. I'll give you an example. There will be a very large chemical plant. They planned to build in Fujian province, the Xiamen. Xiamen is a very beautiful city. They were traveling and so tourism city. But from Taiwan, maybe Taiwan investment, this bigger chemical plant. So why the local residents do? They just walk around. But there will be a great dangerous if you gather most of people to protest, or the government, local government is more powerful to do this as before. They will also policy but the local residents, they will work and they will buy the internet, buy the cell phone. So more and more people join. So the local government eventually change their decision. So because there will be a thing, the upper levels leader, they want to see these things happened. So many people, so they will unrest thing. They don't like see. So more and more people. So environmental performance become more and more thing to assessment. If the central leader to decide which one is do better. This is not GDP, but environmental plans. Okay.
Joanna?
Well, I guess first on the question about are there policies within China to help them become a leader in manufacturing some of these clean technologies? That's a topic that I'm very interested in, and you can look at the strategy. I think the policies are different depending on which technology you're looking at, but there's been some very interesting models of promoting local manufacturing in renewable energy technologies. For example, if you look at the wind industry, one way that China has been effective at doing this is through local content requirements. So, every wind turbine that goes up in China, starting in about 2004, had to be 70% sourced in China. You can debate the WTO implications of that type of a policy, but it was effective in that every foreign wind turbine manufacturer that had been importing wind turbines from Denmark to China, they now have set up factories in China. They're hiring local workers. This helped in some ways in facilitating technology transfer to Chinese factories, although talk about that on another day. But you also have a situation where there's huge support being given to locally owned Chinese companies to conduct R&D in wind power, in solar power manufacturing technologies. And so I think this is a strategic decision on the part of the Chinese government to really build up local manufacturing capacity in these industries, which at the moment, depending on the technology, that wind is fueling the Chinese market. Almost 100% of the wind turbines manufactured there are for China. In PV, it's a different strategy. It's an export strategy. They're fueling the global market, as I mentioned. But I think that this is important because it has implications for really, I mean, if China is entering the large-scale manufacturing of these technologies, costs are coming down. We already see wind turbines made in China are possibly 60-70% cheaper than wind turbines that we're making here in the U.S. and Europe. This could be a big deal in terms of the viability of wind power around the world, including in developing countries. And so when you ask about sort of a new world order, I mean, I'm not an economist, but looking at the potential of these sorts of technologies to be much more accessible, I think China has a very important role to play in that. In terms of recent policies, with the economic stimulus packages that we've been seeing in this country and in China, there was an interesting article in the Financial Times a few days ago about how China's green stimulus package was actually larger than ours. And I actually saw in the Globe this morning that in the clean tech sector, this is one area where jobs are actually increasing, where companies are hiring, where their economic, their numbers are all going up, while everyone else is going down.
All the students started smiling when you said that.
Yeah.
One, and then we'll take two. Eric, do please introduce yourself.
Okay, Eric Kemp-Benedict from the Stockholm Environment Institute. Thank you for very enjoyable presentations. I was wondering if you could comment on, since this is the Pardee Center for the Longer Range Future, thinking about what could happen if the sectoral composition of energy consumption were to change, and it will, as you're saying, in the longer term. Looking at the U.S. has 10 times the energy intensity of China, but we have much more efficient steel production. So if China is going to be moving into more domestic and transport consumption, what's going to happen to the intensity? Just looking at the U.S., it could go up rather than down. And so what do you see happening there? One other real quick question. An alternative to having different metrics for local government officials rather than GDP, to introduce additional ones, one thing you could do is put fees or taxes, pollution fees or taxes, so that you actually see the impact on your GDP, so that you've still got only one metric, but you change the incentives. Do you think within the context of China that it's preferable to introduce different metrics rather than use a financial mechanism?
Imran, again, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Imran Kidwai. I'm a software entrepreneur, but interested in energy. So this concept of export credits for carbon or pollution, if you will, is quite intriguing. And my question relates to that. How, if any thought is being given to it, How is it anticipated to happen in practice? Would it be at very high level, or would it be at the level of, let's say, the box that I go to buy, and that would have an environmental facts box, and every bar of steel and everything would have it. So I would have the ability as a consumer to know what my impact is, and in turn, would it lead to, if you will, a carbon wars between countries fighting whether it's their carbon or somebody else's? And if you will, if I'm let my imagination run wild, so what happens to stuff?
That's what we do here. We let this is the place to go wild.
So if even a product is shipped from one place to another and not used and just goes into the landfill, whose carbon is it that we just buried?
Where in the world is my carbon? We'll take a last one from Carlos.
Hello, my name is Carlos Munoz. I'm from Costa Rica Paradise. Everybody's welcome. And I'm a student at the Fletcher School. I have a question regarding, and I want to challenge the point of capacity at the local level of government. It seems that the power at the higher political levels may be challenged or may feel is being challenged by actions that can take place at the local level. But I want to challenge this point in the sense that would it make any difference if you grant local level authorities some power to make decisions and to take action on making a change on climate change and emissions? And not only that one particular point, but also other environmental issues such as water pollution and probably land degradation and deforestation. And another comment, which I don't know how to turn it into a question, it's regarding China's ability and capacity to adapt to any situation. If you look at the recent Chinese history, they have been able to manage one sort of reform. They made mistakes, they recover, they keep on going, and they show this resilience to continue on because there is an ambition for this country to become a great power. And if this is so, and just to take presence of our host institution here, in the long run, what does this mean for the rest of the world? I think that is an important issue to consider.
Can I, before you respond, these last two questions add on to the same spirit? We've talked about whether China's carbon is actually America's carbon, but there's also a lot of Chinese investment in resources in Africa, in Latin America, buying up of land, buying up of mines, and so on and so forth, which also implies that China's pollution may actually no longer just be in China. Right, so the cycle goes on, but what are, again, linking to this question and the earlier one from Professor Hasnath, what are the global implications of this new, whether it's a carbon war or a carbon whatever, to the world? But let me just open that up.
Okay. I reply the first question. First point, U.S. is not do bad as most people think. They energy efficiency or energy intensity is not so bad. You know, if you look at the data of the OECD country, U.S. do good, maybe average level, but definitely is not the worst. So. Because the U.S., we're talking about the intensity, energy intensity. There will be another data is GDP. U.S. GDP is very high. So compared to, so if we talk about U.S., we compare to Japan, maybe U.S. is more. But compared to most of OECD or European country, U.S. do better. So this is the first point. U.S. is not so bad. And the second, definitely China will increase their energy consumption. You know, China per capita GDP, China is only $2,000 US, but the U.S. there will be $30,000-$40,000. So sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Very quick follow-up. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean energy intensity per capita.
I don't. I know. Yes. There will be a relationship closely between per capita GDP and per capita energy consumption. So there, you never see a country. All of the world, non-country, will this relationship will not exist. They were very close relationship. If you see the data, the per GDP and the per capita energy consumption, there will be a very close relationship. So no country will increase their per GDP, but no consumption, energy consumption increase. So definitely China will increase their. So everyone, you know, everyone in the world, they have the right to increase their living level. Not U.S., but also China, India, developing countries. So it's a human right. You will living better. So you know, in China, the most of the region, maybe south of China, the winter temperature in the most of the South China, they are very low, maybe, but no heating system, you know, and a lot of people have no electricity. So they were talking about two different things. So, but these things are have relationship. So definitely, the China and the developing country, the India, energy consumption will increase. It's inevitable.
Inevitable?
Yes.
Joanna? Including on the carbon markets?
Yep. All right, I'll try to quickly touch on several of the points. I mean, in terms of thinking about how things might change into the future in terms of energy systems and how different countries, not just their per capita levels are different today, but how their energy mix is different, their fuel mix. For example, I think if you were to think about doing electric cars in China or plug-in electric vehicles, if you've got 80% of your electricity being generated by coal, this is not necessarily a cleaner option than continuing to rely on gasoline. So these are the sorts of things that I think matter in that if you're looking at significantly decarbonizing the electricity system, that then opens up other technology options in transportation and other areas, and you need to look at all these things together. In terms of this issue of carbon accounting, I think you've raised many very hard questions, and I think the problem is it's a very hard problem. When we talk about a manufactured product, like this, I don't know what it is yet, but
take it home and find out.
Our value chains are so globalized that you have one. Let's say it's your this laptop, right? You probably had a part of it was made in China, part of it might have been made here, part of it might have been in Japan, and it was sold here. How do you measure all of that? In terms of the carbon accounting of this, who is responsible? Just
to push on that, though, I mean, there is a carbon market already. Mm-hmm. China is the biggest player in terms of provision in that market, the CDM market that you mentioned. But if I'm right, much of that is actually not carbon at all. It's this loophole of HCFCs and these other CFC type things, replacements.
So that's a somewhat of a different issue. And I guess I'll try to take them both. I mean, with CDM, it's basically incentivizing any projects that can measure reductions, right? And so HCFCs, these were these industrial gas capture projects. There was some criticism over whether you should be able to sell these. They're not necessarily sustainable. But I would argue that this just shows the carbon market was functioning properly and that these were very high value greenhouse gases that were sold for a lot of money because they're so potent, much more potent than a
30,000 times.
Yep. That was a problem with the design of the program. The market functioned how it should have. It found the most valuable things and it sold them, which is how we want carbon markets to function. That's the whole reason to use the market. You also have seen, in incentivizing renewable energy projects. And if you look at wind, on the margin, it is actually really helping to support renewable projects. Additionality is a whole other issue. But in terms of doing actual carbon accounting throughout the value chain, and if you had it, labeled on your product, I think this is very hard. I think it's a very interesting academic exercise, and I think it's very important to have this data in hand when you start to talk about things like global greenhouse gas negotiations, because it is part of the puzzle. It's just like the same reason you can't look at just annual emissions and not look at cumulative emissions and not look at per capita emissions. You need to look at these trade flows and how they're going to evolve over time. I would argue the best way to deal with this, particularly in the most energy intensive sectors, is to look at how you could craft an international sectoral agreement, sector by sector, that would capture, for example, if you did an agreement just in the cement sector, you could capture the majority of emissions from cement by just getting a few companies in a room and making them all agree on similar targets, standards, technology, benchmarks. This is obviously harder said than done. There's political reasons why countries don't want to do this, but that would be one way to do it. Same with, you could get a handful of automobile manufacturers in a room, get them to agree on efficiency technology standards, and you've then just addressed emissions from a very dispersed source all over the world.
We'll take one more round, and we don't want to get into this right now, but on this thing, come back if I'm still here in 10 years. And I would bet that this would actually have a carbon footprint number on it. And if not, we'll give you another one of these. We'll take one more round, 1, 2, and 3. Minye.
Hi, Michael, developer
please.
from College of Engineering. 2 points or 2 questions. One, I thought I heard that energy prices were low relative to the world market. So that sort of implies that somebody's subsidizing those energy markets. And so what is the nature, who's providing that subsidy? Because if you let energy prices float up, energy use goes down and you get an appropriate balance. And the second is, I hear this notion about local and central government, but the local government is responsible for providing jobs. And when you go through China, there's huge areas that need employment and to get out from the peasantry into the city. How do you, that's it would seem to be that's a major driver, and that sure, the central government wants to do all this wonderful stuff, but at the end of the day, it's the local governments providing jobs. So I see that as a huge tension. So any comments about how that's all?
We'll take 2 more, gentlemen at the back, and then Minye.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Presented really very rich data there. I'm Min Yan, is professor in the School of Management from business background, business and economics. I think, based on the presentations, a lot of data to talk about how serious the problem is, and also the tendency of the Chinese government in making, changes, etc. I want to share some of my observations and some of my thoughts in terms of 3 major dilemmas from the Chinese government point of view. The first one we touched is really about the dilemma between economic development and the pollution issue. That's a very huge, big macro issues. The second one is really about the reforms on privatization of the companies and the pollution generated. For example, my hypothesis would be the multinational companies probably would generate the smallest share of pollutions. That's my assumption. And state-owned companies, the SOEs, would be the number 2 because the centrally controlled government really control the huge, big organizations. For example, if you look at the capital steel, overnight they said you have to move out of the capital city, and they had to do it. So the central government does have that power and is capable of doing that. But the least would be this, as a result of privatization, a lot of middle-sized firm and small firm entrepreneurs in the rural village-based organizations, the technologies they received are the obsoleted technologies from bigger state-owned companies, etc. And my hypothesis is that group really generated a lot of pollution there. And so that's a dilemma between the privatization program and also the pollution control program. The third dilemma is really about these incentives. As I said, I have a business and economics background. So the incentives are really something very, very critical. I heard that when the news report or media report some heavy pollution agent in certain part of the country, and the central government will send their agencies representatives to handle that. But as soon as they arrive at the plant, they find the plant is shut already, because the local officials already told them a week ago. And immediately after, the group leaves, and then they got, restarted again. So it's really, the third dilemma is really.
I heard that only happened in Pakistan.
Well, the issue is really about the local, the balance, again, as a dilemma. The local residents, citizens really depend on those industries to make money, to make their living standards living better, and the other is really the pollution. I think the incentive is this, like the proprietary rights issue, that eventually it works is the economic leverage. In other words, if the Chinese realize if you don't protect this right, you are going to suffer. So in other words, when they realize, if the local government officials realize that profitability, performance would help me promotion, and at the same time, if you do something bad, the environment can kill my career. So in that sense, it will work.
Thank you for those points. We'll take, if you could pass the mic up front, two very quick comments from my two IR colleagues, Minye and Joe Fewsmith.
Okay, I'll be very quick. I think the discussion today focuses on industry justifiably, but I think maybe the discussion can also project in the future, which is consumer consumption of energy would increase dramatically. And because Chinese infrastructure for the consumption energy is still in the early stage, so we probably, if we take that segment seriously, we'll probably have time to do something, like introduce newer renewable energy for the residential consumption. So I think the Chinese government, I hope the discussion could be more far-sighted than just focusing on the existing problem.
Yeah, very, very important point that the consumption patterns also change. Joe.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. I wanted to pick up on the political economy problems that Xiaowei talked about, particularly the fact that some of these energy company people have very powerful political positions. And if you're a little clerk down there in the NDRC, which is a pretty powerful organization, but these 121 people, they just don't have the power. And the trend seems to be going the wrong way, not the right way. And the example, of course, everybody's favorite example, Li Xiaopeng, former premier's son, who's been chairman of Huaneng Energy Corporation and is now vice governor of Shanxi province, but retains his directorship at Huaneng. It seems to me that the incentives for Huaneng to control its pollution are zero.
And Huaneng is for non-China folks here.
China Electric Company.
China Electric.
China Energy, something like that. It's one of the very big corporations. And, that's just you may not want to get into his personal story, but the direction seems to be going the wrong way, that more of these heavy, big actors in the energy sector are moving into the political sector rather than the political sector controlling them. So will it really be better?
So four excellent points, and maybe if very briefly, if you could also wrap up your concluding comments. We'll again start with you.
Okay. First question is you mentioned the local government is responsible for the employment, so they maybe lack incentive to change. So, but the heavy industry is capital intensive, then not labor intensive. So the local government welcome heavy industry. Mostly they are not for concern the local employment level and other service and light industry. I think they will be. And your question is, yes, I think the incentive. Yeah, yes, China most of the policy is depending on the commander. It's political. So, yes, they have effective in most place, but you mentioned that in larger, medium or retail enterprise, they lack of incentive to do. So yes, you're right. There will be a combination of political instruments and the market instruments. So get the price right will be the direction of the. So this year will be if you see the government report, there will be this year will be the price of energy reform will be going on. So, but we need the two things going on. The two things, the political things, the market reform just I mentioned. So there were two things also.
Thank you.
Quickly. So I just needed to add is for you there will be a technology will play an important role. For example, the SO2 emission control. In 2005 or 2004, there will be 2% of power plant to install equipment to get rid of the SO2. But the government they invented the online how to say operation. You can there will be a device to for the power plant. You can see the environmental protection agency office whose which power plant
Like real time monitoring.
yeah, real time, yes, monitoring which power plant run the run the SO2 equipment. So you can, and the central government environmental policy also connected to the local. So in the Beijing you can say if a power plant they don't run the equipment to get rid of SO2, so you can see there will be a red light. so you know now in 2008 will be exceeded 50% of power plant had already installed FGD. So maybe in 2010 most of the power plant had installed. So it's a big change. So the technology will be important. So.
Joanna?
I think that we're certainly not going to solve China's environmental problems by just shutting down all the heavy industry and having a lot of people out of work, right? I mean, that's pretty much the worst situation we could have, and particularly in terms of the stability of the country. That is exactly what the Communist Party would like to avoid, right? So I think the upside of this is that the choice between economic development and environmental quality is a false dichotomy. I think there's no reason you can't grow your economy while also reducing your emissions, and renewable energy is obviously one way you can do this. We're not talking about necessarily using less energy, although we should certainly use it more efficiently. You can certainly still generate energy, fuel your economy with lower emissions sources. That's one thing, and you can also do it, by selling products that are more service oriented. Whether or not China, can shift to that, I think it's more of a global issue. And I think that the problem is, even if China cement production shifts from China to Vietnam or to Africa, is this necessarily going to help the situation? Probably not. You're better off cleaning it up somewhere than just moving it somewhere else. And I think that this issue of small firms versus large firms and state-owned firms versus private firms, yes, a lot of the problem is these small firms, and there's a lot of data that backs up what you were saying. I think the interesting thing about the state-owned firms, and Huaneng being one, is that Huaneng is actually one of the largest developers of wind power in China. Why are they doing this? Out of the goodness of their heart? No. The government has actually put very aggressive renewable targets on them. And this is, as you said, that they can be very closely controlled because of their ties. And but I think that they're actually seeing the incentive behind doing this. And Huaneng is also one of the companies that is aware of climate change, is pretty aggressive, has made some pretty aggressive statements about their own corporate actions on this. So I actually think you'll see some of these companies become leaders in this area, which will be interesting to watch. And then just briefly to conclude, I mean, as you mentioned, I think the consumption problem, China's consumption problem, is the problem of the future, even if it's not the problem of today. And it would be very short-sighted to just focus on, your crisis management, right? I mean, the crisis right now is heavy industry, it's the economic downturn. It's very easy to look at the current situation, roll back environmental measures because you want to make sure, that you're okay tomorrow as opposed to where you'll be in 20, 30 years. In many ways, we have a lot of opportunity right now with the amount of money that's being invested in infrastructure. It would be a real shame if this infrastructure wasn't, if we're going to be putting it into updating power grids, this should be using, efficient smart grid technology that can promote a lot more renewables, a lot higher penetrations of renewables, can look at doing electric vehicle systems, look at doing much more efficient buildings, for all the buildings that are being constructed using efficient building standards. So I think that it's very hard to be it's very easy to be short-sighted, and it's very hard to really think about the long term.
Very briefly also on Michael's question about energy prices, and is there a subsidy? Why are the energy prices low?
Yes,
okay.
there, but maybe you should take that.
Very briefly.
Yeah.
Who's supplying the subsidy?
Yes, the government is the next generation people subsidized today. For example, oil, the government will maybe not decided, but they will set the range of so yes, the oil company will directly the oil company will subsidy to the consumer if they give gasoline also. So the Sinopec and CNPC, if they subsidy too much, the government will the physical they will give money to these two companies. But the government set the resource price. The resource price is very low, so the resource tax is very low compared to. So it means the next generation people will subsidize this generation people. Yes.
Thank you very, very much, everyone. Before I thank our guests, I mean both of them seem to have an optimistic streak, which we really like.
You have
here.
to be in this business.
You have to, otherwise you'll die of depression. But I don't know if China is going to help the world sink through this crisis or swim through this crisis. But this I know: without China, we don't get to the other side, one way or the other. So China is going to be central to this story, not just for China, but for the world. One little plug and then my thanks. We have announced, and we have this on our website, some of you might have known about it or heard about it. We've at the Pardee Center, we've just announced our summer graduate fellowship program. So if you're a graduate student, look it up and think of applying. If you are a faculty member, do please think of your best students and encourage them to apply for the summer fellowship. We have it's hopefully going to be a nice program and a prestigious program for them. My thanks to both of you for a wonderful, wonderful conversation. My thanks to Joe Fewsmith for helping us bring you here. My thanks to all of you for being here today, and have a wonderful rest of the century.
Or spring break.